Trump has had a busy start to his second term. He's fired thousands of federal workers, cut funding to anything with the word DEI in it, and insisted he wants to annex Canada.
Only that last one is legal. Crazily enough. Just him saying that he can annex Canada. I'm not saying that it would be legal if he did it without approval. But out of all those things, somehow him talking about invading and conquering our friendliest neighbor is the only thing in this that's legal.
To name just a few things. You might expect all this to have provoked a furious reaction from Democrats, but they've been remarkably muted in their opposition, and perhaps...
Look, I'm sorry, Chuck Schumer, but if foreign commentators, TLDR, these are a bunch of Brits, these are a bunch of Brit-bongers, these are Europeans, these are people across the Atlantic. They take their binoculars, they look across the Atlantic, and what do they see? They see Chuck Schumer shuffling away, not using that 60-vote leverage. You know, well, what's the plan to reopen the government? Okay, let's say Trump does keep the government shut for all those months. Then what? You don't think that's going to affect people's day-to-day life? It is going to affect people's day-to-day life. It'd be one thing if there was some passionate, like, fine, we're not going to go through with this because we want to keep the government open because we don't want to give them the powers that could come from the defunding of the judicial system. But here's our plan moving forward to add pressure. What I heard from Chuck Schumer was, yeah, we'll add pressure, but we got to wait for them to hit this, like, polling data, and then we can really slam them. If you don't add the pressure, they're not going to get to those numbers. I mean, I do not believe that if you made the impetus on a government shutdown based upon, hey, you cannot just fire all the federal government and workers. I don't believe that Elon Musk should have free access to everybody's social security data. If you make those the impetus upon which you're blocking a CR, look, all you have to do is follow the Constitution. We'll pass a CR. Maybe that's some fight. Now, I understand wanting to keep the judiciary open. I understand that. But if you don't follow it up with some pressure campaign, you don't even give the appearance of a fight. And that's why Donald Trump thanked Chuck Schumer on social media, because it failed to even give the appearance of a fight, the appearance of pressure.
The most visible display of protest we've seen so far was when the Democrats held up paddles with grumpy slogans on them during Trump's address to Congress in
so silly
early March. Unsurprisingly, voters aren't impressed, and the Democrat brand has cratered. In recent polls by NBC News and CNN, the party has seen its lowest ever approval ratings, 27% and 29% respectively, in large part because frustrated Democrats say they disapprove of their own leadership. Conversely, Trump's approval ratings have actually held up better than our viewers might think. According to Nate Silver's poll aggregator, while Trump is now in negative territory, with more Americans saying they disapprove of his leadership than approve, his approval rating is still in the high 40s, and voters generally have a more favorable view of the Republican Party than the Democrats.
But let's also keep this in historical vision here, because, for example, if you look at the midterms of how the Republicans were formed in 2022, you can say, hey, they won the House. But on historical trends, they should have done much better than they did. And that's why Republicans felt deflated on that night. Right now, Biden, at the same time in his presidency, he had like a 65% approval rating. The historical average should be about right there. As of a month ago, it should have been like 70%. Trump's already in the negative. This is supposed to be what people call the honeymoon period. You know when Harris just jumped into the race and everybody placed upon her the endless possibilities of what somebody besides these two old guys could be? And then we got to see her run. That period was a honeymoon period. Her numbers were the best they were for the whole campaign in that period. Now, I think it was a bunch of other factors involved, but that was definitely part of it. And that's also the period that Trump started with, where he's not addressing the key issues of his campaign. So that's why we've seen that the slow start, the low start that has already glided into the negatives. Historically speaking, Trump's at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to approval ratings at this time in the president's administration.
So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at where the Democrats might go from here, and what we should expect the party to look like when, or if, it recovers from the aftershock of 2024. Who's the best politician right now? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. We use Trump, i.e. basically two questions that the Democrats need to answer. First, how do they oppose Trump? i.e. how do they convince voters that Trump is bad? And second, what should their policy platform be? i.e. how do they convince voters that Democrats are good? Let's start with the first question, how to oppose Trump. Broadly speaking, there are two schools of thought here. First, we have who we might call loud Democrats, and then we have quiet Democrats. Loud Democrats argue that the Democrats need to be more vocal, to be angrier in their criticism of Trump. After all, Trump is doing some pretty radical stuff that Democrats really don't like, firing thousands of federal workers, threatening to impeach inconvenient judges, and slashing Biden's big climate initiatives. On top of all the domestic stuff, Trump's foreign policy is almost the opposite of Biden's. While neither of them like China's trade practices, Biden was a committed Atlanticist who liked talking about democracies versus autocracies. Trump, on the other hand, thinks the EU was made to screw America and has no qualms with buddying up to autocrats. Anyway, loud Democrats point to all this and argue that, in not being vocal enough in their criticism, Democrats are essentially letting Trump get away with it. Quiet Democrats, on the other hand, think the loud Dems are making three mistakes. First, they know that most voters, and especially the Democrat skeptic voters they need to win back, just aren't persuaded by the whole Trump is a threat to democracy argument, as 2024 demonstrated. Second, they worry that constant outrage just overwhelms voters and prevents Democrats from actually being able to draw voters' attention when they really need to. Quiet Democrats instead argue that Democrats should save up their outrage and express it selectively, so that when they do, voters actually notice. But third, quiet Democrats argue that Trump is doing enough damage to himself, and that shouting about it risks turning Trump's failures into partisan contests. To give a concrete example, quiet Democrats worry that shouting too much about DOGE risks inviting a wider argument about the size of the state, with the Democrats forced into saying they like a big state and the Republicans saying they like a small state, which is probably the more popular position with the median voter. Quiet Democrats instead suggest that Democrats should just let Elon Musk cut away at the federal government, and when something inevitably breaks, the blame will be laid exclusively at Trump's feet. Anyway, the disagreement between quiet and loud Democrats was made glaringly apparent earlier this month, when Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who's probably more on the quiet side of things, decided to vote with Republicans to keep the government funded through September, instead of withholding votes and threatening a government shutdown. This is a defensible position, but loud Democrats in Congress thought it was just too passive, given this was based...
Okay, so, just pause for a second because I want to give my thoughts. I think that there is some truth to over-outraging the public. That if you constantly are yelling from the rooftops, it can make people think, oh, they're yelling again. Now, that doesn't mean the issues that you're not talking about could not be of import. There's a lot of important issues, but people want to be able to know when the red alarm is to really turn around. And there have been issues where we have done that, but there have been enough of them that it could be exhausting for the general public. And when you're working from your 9-to-5 job and you get home and you're with your kids, do you really want to spend the little hours you have with your family learning about complex trade arrangements or international law or our system of checks and balances and the importance of the federal bureaucracy's impartiality when it comes to its implementation of state policy? No. You want to go on your couch, you want to watch cartoons with your kids, you want to send them off to bed, sleep with your wife, and then pass out, right? That's what you want to do. And so that's what people do, if you're lucky. And so if you always fire the alarm off, it's going to be easier for them to ignore you. But let's be clear, a government shutdown is not something you can just, with a little bit of outrage, right? This isn't something that applies to the situation where Chuck Schumer caved in. I could imagine this applying to us acting this outrage anytime Trump says something deeply offensive, as if this is like the end of democracy. Because he says things that are offensive all the time. But when he, for example, ignores a court and deports people to a El Salvadorian prison, even though they're completely innocent, after the court told them not to, illegal deportations, that can affect anyone. If you don't like the final alarm fire, If you don't make a noise about it, then there is a signal that's being said, which is go ahead. Which is go ahead. They've pushed and they felt no pushback, so they can feel that they can continue to push. And as much as Chuck Schumer might want to wait and see, we've already wait and saw, and we already saw disaster. We see the plane crashes. We see the lack of economic attention. We see the geopolitical mismanagement. And so how many people do we have to wait to get caught up in these crises or these disasters or these international kerfluffles that could get tens of thousands of people killed before we say, okay, now we're going to add the pressure, even though he has one of the worst honeymoon periods a president has ever had, only outperformed by himself during his last term. And if we did a government shutdown, let's be clear, the polling on this is clear. Let's be clear, the polling on this is clear. The majority of Americans would blame the Republicans for a government shutdown at this point. They control the presidency. They control the legislature. For all intents and purposes, from an activist perspective, they control, or at least have immense more influence on the Supreme Court than do the liberal judges. So if there is a government shutdown, from the voters' perspective, who do you blame? Well, we would have to get every Democrat vote for this continuing CR. Oh, did you guys negotiate with them? Well, no, we didn't want to negotiate with them. They said they didn't like our CR that we didn't negotiate with when we needed 60 votes, and so we just shut the government. The blame would fall on them. The blame would fall on them. Now, if you make that calculation that the blame would largely fall on them, it would be damaging for them, and they'd be already shooting themselves in the foot. I mean, look, I understand the midterm's 2 years away, but losing these early honeymoon periods, I mean, Biden never recovered. Biden never recovered. And if you compound a government shutdown with a foreign policy disaster in Ukraine and all these unfulfilled promises, eventually these things stack up to the point where you can't dig yourself out of this hole. And that's what Trump's doing right now. He's already in the negative. The hole is being dug. So the goal should be to bury him. The goal should be to bury him.
Basically, the only.
And so, I mean, I understand, but there has to be some wider pressure campaign. If we don't use this, then there has to be some other strategy. It cannot. The wait and see James Carville approach is a terrible idea. Sure, Trump might end up, tying his own noose around his neck, but if you're, politically speaking, if you're his opponent, why not kick out the chair?
Leverage they had over Trump, and polling suggests most Democrat voters agree. Anyway, aside from how to oppose Trump, the second question for Democrats is how they should recalibrate their policy platform after 2024. There are some more left-wing Democrats who actually think the Democrats should basically stick with their policies from last year, or even move to the left. These Democrats argue that Trump only won because of a global inflationary episode, which is why basically every incumbent lost last year.
No, it's not only that. It's also, okay, here's the problem. Was these tax proposals that Harris was throwing out there something that represented the incumbency or represented a change? She did not break herself from Biden. How do you most clearly break yourself from Biden? Bold change. It doesn't need to be, we'll offer sex change to every child. It doesn't need to be, I think when people think, more left, they just mean more crazy or something. No, it could mean, look, every American should have health care. And my job as president should be, by the end of my administration, to make sure every single American in this country has health care by 2030. That is our goal. That is what we will strive for. And look, maybe you miss, okay? Aim for the stars, maybe hit the moon, whatever. But it's bold. It's something. It's something. And when you say tax credit upon a, first-time home buyer, $25,000 down payment, and then you let's expand the insulin cap. These things are nice. They're good. They're transformative. They really help people's lives. They're not marketable. For the individuals they help, if they tie it to Biden, maybe, but it's not enough.
Usually by larger margins than the Democrats, and that pivoting towards the centre risks looking insincere or dry and technocratic when Democrats need enthusiasm. There's also a sense among these Democrats that Trump, who is less popular than almost any previous president, will be so unpopular by 2028 that Democrats won't need to do anything to win, and so should just stick with their current policy platform to avoid infighting. Nonetheless, recent Gallup...
No, don't stick with the current policy platform. Change. If you can't beat this unpopular Trump at this point, then there's a problem with your current policy platform.
Polling suggests a plurality of Democrats think the party needs to move to the centre if it wants to win back power. Not least because moderate Democrats massively outperformed their Liberal peers last year. However, what Democrats actually mean when they talk about the centre is very much unclear. This presumably means moving to the right on cultural issues, but it's not really clear what this means for economic policy, which is voters' number one issue at the moment. After all, what is a centrist economic policy in the current American context? Presumably, Democrats don't mean a return to the neoliberal program of tax cuts and deregulation. Equally, balancing the budget, which is how Bill Clinton restored Democrat credibility on the economy back in the 90s, doesn't look easy. The deficit is currently running at 6% of GDP, double what Clinton inherited, so balancing it would require significantly steeper tax hikes or spending cuts.
And this is the thing. Let's say you do balance the budget, okay? And this is the reason Trump's not going to balance the budget. He didn't balance it last time, and people got on my DMs. I got some conservatives in my DMs actually trying to convince me, Dylan, like, you can talk about the Constitution or whatever when it comes to gutting these government institutions, but I mean, we got to save the country from the deficit, man. He's not going to get rid of the deficit. He failed the first time. He's going to fail the second time. And the reason is just because the political benefit's just not there. What's Trump really going to get if he gets rid of the deficit? How will that affect people's day-to-day life? How does that poll? Really, like, when you poll Americans, how important is cutting the deficit down scaled to other bigger issues he could be yapping about, whether it's immigration or tabletop economic issues? Now, I'm not saying this doesn't affect the tabletop economic issues. It's just people have been yapping about the deficit for so long, I don't think people really necessarily see it like that immediately. And so, what? Are you going to show fiscal prudence towards the issues that you care about? Balance the budget, just to hand over an economy to your opposition, who will then use all of that fiscal prudence to spend away on their priorities instead of yours. And so there's a motivation, a political motivation, to kind of spend it while you got it.
The big idea in this space at the moment is what's become known as abundance liberalism. In short, abundance liberals argue that the left's obsession with process and protecting various minority groups has meant that Democrat administrations don't actually get anything done. Houses are more expensive in Democrat-run areas than Republican-run areas because restrictive regulation prevent building. Texas builds more renewable energy than California for similar reasons, and Democrats are famously bad at building public transport, despite their enthusiasm for it. Abundance liberals argue that the state is still needed to achieve progressive ideals of affordable housing, clean energy, and accessible public transport, but that it needs to be unleashed by deregulation, even if that means less explicit protections or guarantees for certain minority groups. Ultimately, there's no easy answer to either of these questions, but Democrats would be well advised to make up their collective minds very soon.
If there's anything to take from this, it's one thing. Is that even the Brit bongers can see the jelly spine. Exactly. Democrats need to stop talking about minorities and that stuff. No.